www.videonews.com
はい、それでは、時間になりましたので大変お待たせいたしました。ただいまからアウンサンスーチーさんの記者会見を始めさせていただきます。皆さんもよくご存知だと思いますので、本当に簡単にご紹介をさせていただきます。アウンサンスーチーさん、日本には27年ぶりに、この間の土曜日に来日されました。東京だけではなくて、80年代半ばに研究者として過ごされた京都にも訪問されています。1988年に国民民主連盟を結成、1989年以降、これまでに合わせて3度、通算15年にわたり、軍事政権により自宅軟禁を余儀なくされました。1991年にはノーベル平和賞を受賞されています。去年6月、受賞から21年目にして、ノルウェーで受賞演説をされたのは記憶に新しいところです。で2010年11月に自宅軟禁が解かれ、民政移管後の昨年4月に行われた議会の補欠選挙で当選されました。今日はこれまでの日本滞在の印象のほか、お国の民主化の進展の具合ですとか、国会議員としての活動などについてお話を伺いたいというふうに思っております。会見の進め方ですけれども、まずはじめに短くスピーチをいただこうと思っております。でその後、質疑応答ということですが、質疑応答は2部構成で、まずは代表質問、そして会場の皆様からの直接質問という形で進めていきたいと思います。申し遅れましたけれども、私は司会を担当いたしますクラブ企画委員で日本テレビの小栗と申します。代表質問はスーチーさんのお隣に座っていますクラブ企画委員で TBS テレビの杉尾秀哉報道局解説室長です。それでは早速アウンサンスーチーさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you. I'm grateful for this opportunity to meet the members of the press of Japan and I think perhaps the non-press members of the audience. It is a great pleasure for me to be here in Japan today after 27 years. It has been a wonderful experience for me, particularly because the ordinary people of Japan have been so welcoming and so warm in their support for what we have been trying to achieve in Burma over the last 24 years. I'm here mainly to answer questions, so I will not take up too much of your time with a long speech. I simply want to say that I welcome this opportunity to exchange ideas with you, to answer any questions that you may have about the situation in our country, what we're trying to achieve and what we hope to achieve, and how Japan and Burma can work together for the promotion of democratic values in our world, not just for what we can do for each other. So please put any questions that you wish to put to me very openly. I will answer them to the best of my ability. I can't guarantee that you will always like my answers, but at least I hope they will be honest ones. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。それでは早速、杉尾さん、代表質問をお願いいたします。
はい、まず私の方から、15年間の長きにわたって、自宅軟禁されながら、その民主化を訴え続けてこられたアウンサンスーチーさんの不屈の闘志にですね、敬意を表したいと思います。その上でですね、3つお聞かせ願えればと思います。まず1つ目の質問なんですけれども、27年ぶりの日本訪問ということなんですけれども、当時と比較して今の日本の率直な印象というのはいかがでしょうか。それからまた今回の訪問を契機にして、日本からどのような支援とか協力を期待されておられるのか、それについて伺いたいと思います。
And the third question will come later?
Yeah.
All right. What is the greatest difference? The greatest difference I find is in the young people of Japan. I find that they know a lot more about Burma than they did 27 years ago, and they have been so very warm in their support that I'm very touched and very encouraged, because I think that this bodes very well for the future of our two countries. This is the immediate impression I got, that the young people of Japan today are more interested in Burma than they were 27 years ago. And with regard to the kind of cooperation we expect from Japan, this would be at two levels, one on the level of the government and one on the level of the people of Japan. I always put more importance on people than on governments, but of course, to be practical, we would like as much help from the government as possible, because they're in a position to give it. And we hope that the aid that is given to my country will be given with the people in mind rather than the government of our country in mind. As I keep trying to remind everybody, governments come and governments go, but people go on forever.
次の質問なんですが、民主化で経済発展がですね、加速しております。その一方で、その影の部分として、民族対立、宗教対立というのが激しくなっている現状。そうした中で、その国民の和解、それからその海外に多数いる、難民の帰還を進めるために、アウンサンスーチーさん自身がですね、どういうふうに関わって、どういうふうに行動されようとされているのか、それについてお聞かせください。
Reconciliation has always been a very important issue in our country. Burma is made up of many ethnic nationalities, and since independence, there has never been a time when we have had complete peace throughout our land. This is something we have yet to achieve. Economic development, economic success we achieved to a certain extent before the military regime took over in 1962, and I'm confident that we are capable of once again achieving economic success. But basic to that, of course, is unity in our country, peace and unity. Without peace and without unity, we cannot really expect to get economic success that can be sustained. For sustainable development, whether it's economic, political, or social, we need peace and unity. This is a very, very difficult thing to achieve. And I, as the chairman of the chairperson of the Committee for Rule of Law in my country, and I'm the chair of the Rule of Law because I believe strongly in the importance of rule of law. I believe that this is the way forward for our country. We must establish rule of law so that everybody in our country will feel secure. Unless there is security, we will not be able to achieve national reconciliation. People cannot talk to one another and exchange views and try to find a harmonious solution until they feel safe with one another, until they feel safe in our country. So I think the first step towards national reconciliation in our country should be the establishment of rule of law.
少数民族の中からはですね、もう少しそのスーチーさんに積極的になっていただきたいという、そういう声もあるようですが、いかがでしょうか。
I'm not quite sure what they mean by more positive and forceful in promoting the movement. What movement? Everybody expects that their movement, their stand, should be looked upon as the only right one. I do not think this is the way to achieve reconciliation. We have to recognize the validity of everybody's hopes and aspirations and sort out the differences. I think I was asked earlier at an interview why I have not been speaking much about ethnic nationalities since my release. In fact, I've been speaking all the time about ethnic nationalities, but the point was that my statements were not colorful enough to please everybody. Actually, I'm not very keen on colorful statements. I tend to make statements which I think are necessary and which I consider an honest reflection of how I think and how I feel. Because for me, the most important thing in politics is to be honest with the public. The public may not always like what I say, but at least they cannot accuse me of having deceived them in any way. And I'm sorry if people do not find my comments interesting enough to acknowledge them, but I've been speaking a lot about ethnic nationalities and the problems of national reconciliation in our country. Except that I speak in a way which I suppose most people consider slightly boring. I talk about the importance of rule of law. I talk about the necessity to respect different points of views. I speak about the possibility of building unity out of diversity, provided you are prepared to be open-minded and you are prepared to accept that others' views may be as valid as your own.
はい。最後の質問なんですけれども、アウン・サン・スー・チーさんは大統領の就任にですね、今回の訪日の機会にもですね、意欲を見せる発言をされてこられております。で、その大統領就任に意欲を見せておられる、その要するに目的というか、要するに何を達成されたいのかということと、またその大統領になるためには、2015年の次期総選挙までに、今の憲法をですね、改正することが必要だというふうにされています。で、その目的達成のためにどういう道筋を描いていらっしゃるのかお聞かせください。
I find that people are very interested in the fact that I said that I would like to be president, and yet I would quite like to meet the leader of any political party who doesn't really want to be the head of government. I do not understand why they make themselves heads of political parties if they don't really want to become the heads of government or of the state. So I wonder whether there isn't a lot of false modesty around in politics everywhere in the world. And I know that many press people are surprised when I say, quite frankly, yes, I want to be president, because that way I can get to implement all the policies in which I believe. Of course, as you very rightly pointed out, there are certain parts of the Constitution which I think were deliberately included to stop me from becoming president. Now, I do not think any Constitution anywhere should be written with one person in mind, either to keep that person out of a certain position or to keep a person in a certain position. That is not how the Constitution of a country should be written, which is why I object to it, not mainly because it is aimed against me, but because it is most unconstitutional to aim at one person. A constitution should be about a whole country. The only way in which our constitution can be amended as it stands is by a majority of more than 75% agreeing to change. Now, this is not with regard to every part of the Constitution, but to the most important parts of the Constitution. Change can be achieved only if more than 75% of the members of the legislature agree to change. And as 25% of the members of the legislature are representatives of the army, nominated by the commander-in-chief, it means that we have to, I always say that we will need at least one brave soldier plus all the civilian representatives in order to amend the bits of the Constitution that we want amended. So it means that we will have to amend the Constitution through agreement with the military. And that is how I want it. I want changes in our country to be achieved through agreement between different forces in our country. That is what I mean by national reconciliation, the ability to talk to one another and to sort out our differences and to come to a harmonious settlement. I've always said that our country is poor in the culture of negotiated compromise, but it is something towards which we must work and towards which I am working as best I can.
はい、じゃあ私の質問は
今のお答えの中で一つだけ追加で伺わせていただけたらと思うんですけれども、最初にその支援についても、政権だとか、政府ということを念頭に置くのではなくて、国民を念頭に支援してほしいというふうにおっしゃいました。そこはやはりその軍人がまだ支配的な政権であるというところが、あるのかなというふうに思うんですけれども、憲法にしても国会の在り方にしても、今そういう状態だということはもともとご存知だったと思いますが、政治家になられて改めてすごく障壁だなというふうに感じられている点というのは多くあるんでしょうか。
The largest obstacle is, of course, the mindset of those who are used to a military dictatorship. I've often said that it's not a military mindset that worries me. A military mindset is a disciplined mind. It's a mind that accepts a chain of command. But a military dictatorship mindset is something altogether different. And the great majority of the members of the government at present were part of the military government 3 years ago. So there is much that needs to be changed with regard to the mindset of those who are now ruling Burma. And I'm not saying that help to Burma should be people-centered. rather than government-centered because of the present government. I think that as a matter of principle, help to countries like ours should always be people-centered. Even when we become the government, then I would rather that help is people-centered rather than government-centered. But of course, a government that is truly representative of the people will have interests which are the same as the interests of the people.
ありがとうございました。それでは会場の皆さんから、質問をいただきたいと思います。質問のある方は手を挙げていただけたらと思います。一人でも多くの皆さんから質問をしていただきたいと思いますので、お一人一問簡潔な形で、質問していただけたらと思います。それではまずそちらの女性の方お願いいたします。マイクから遠い方には係の者が参りますので、よろしくお願いいたします。まず社名と氏名を名乗ってからよろしくお願いいたします。
はい、TBS テレビの加古と申します。Please let me speak in English because I want to deliver a dialect message to you. I'd like to ask you about the Japan's support towards Myanmar. Japan has been financially supporting Myanmar even when the other Western countries were working on sanctions to a military government. How did you see that while under house arrest? And plus, even after Myanmar declared its democratization, Japan restarted 50 billion yen of international loan to the government. But do you think it will work out in a good way for realizing democratization? And what do you expect the most in Japan's support from now on?
The way in which many countries in the world approach the question of military dictatorship in my country differed from one country to the other. And although the Western countries instituted sanctions against Burma, it is true that Japan continued to help Burma. But as I said, I was always most concerned that the help should go to the people rather than help to shore up the power of the government. And I think much of the support that Japan gave to Burma did go to the people. But I think we need to be more careful about it. We need to make sure that the help that is given to my country is actually what is needed by our people. And for this, I would like the government of Japan to consult not just the executive, that is to say, not just the government, but the legislature and we who represent the opposition as well. Unless there is equal engagement with the government, that is to say the executive and the legislature and the opposition, there is always a possibility that the help given to my country may not go in the right way.
ありがとうございます。その他の質問いかがでしょうか。それではそちらの方。
朝日新聞の柴田と申します。よろしくお願いします。2年前にテインセン政権ができてですね、その後スーチーさんがテインセン大統領に会われて以降、いわゆる改革っていうのが急速に進んだと思うんですけれども、テインセン政権2年間のレビュー、これの評価を聞きたい。特にテインセン大統領個人のですね、改革者として、どういうふうに評価するかというご意見をお聞かせください。以上です。
I usually do not assess politicians as individuals. I only assess them in terms of what they do. So let me just assess the record of the Thein Sein government with regard to reform. I've always said that the great weakness of this reform process is that it has no structure. There does not seem to be a definite reform policy. There has been no proper sequencing or the establishment of priorities with regard to what is needed for our country at the moment. It's not enough to say any aid is welcome. It's not enough to think that the more you get, the better. It does not work like that. You have to, first of all, decide what is most necessary in our country and how those needs should be met. I find that a weakness with this present government. With regard to the legislature, of which I'm a member, I have been pleasantly surprised by how much we have been able to achieve, because I I think I must remind you, as I have been reminding other people, that there are only 45 members of the NLD in this legislature, which numbers over 620. So we are a very, very small opposition group, although we are still the biggest opposition group. As I think a lot of you know, the ruling party won by over 82% back in 2010. In spite of the fact that we are very small in number, we have been able to achieve quite a lot. We have been able to get some of our motions adopted, and this is because of the cooperation of members of other parties, including the ruling party, the USDP, and because of the even-handed of the speakers of our two houses of the legislature. The legislature has been increasing in transparency and in democratic processes over the last year. I like to think it has something to do with the fact that we have entered the legislature. But I think in all fairness, I must admit that we owe a lot of this to the Speaker of our lower house, who has been particularly enthusiastic about democratic processes and practices. And I am confident that this will increase with time. The judiciary is a big problem. A problem for me as the chair of the Rule of Law Party, but more a problem for our country. Our judiciary is not free from interference by the executive. In fact, I would say that it is totally dependent on the executive, and that is a very dangerous situation. I have said earlier how necessary rule of law is for our country, and unless we have an independent and fair judiciary, we will not be able to establish genuine rule of law. And this is something that we have to work towards as much as possible.
ありがとうございました。それではこちらの方お願いいたします。
Pio De Miglia from Italy, Sky TG24. You may remember me, we met last time in NDL headquarters 1 year ago, maybe 1.5 years ago. At that time, I remember very well that you were much more skeptical than now. You look very much more optimistic now. And I remember that you were still deciding whether to candidate yourself or not for the elections. And you said that two main issues would be the freedom of all political prisoners and the end of the repressive actions, military actions against the minorities. Now, is your optimism due to the fact that these two issues have been somehow solved, or they are still prisoners, political prisoners in Burma, and still violent action against the minority? And when you talk about national reconciliation, we have in history many cases of national reconciliation. Do you have more in mind the Mandela solution, a state commission for admitting responsibility but immunity, or the Argentine situation where the generals were eventually prosecuted and jailed?
The reason why I'm more optimistic, I think I answered just now, is that the legislature has turned out to be far more democratic than I had expected, and that we have been able to achieve much more as a minority group within the legislature than I had expected. I also said just now that I was not entirely happy about either the executive or the judiciary. And as to the two issues that you mentioned, the release of political prisoners and the problems with the ethnic nationalities, I do not think that these have yet been resolved. We still have political prisoners in Burma. The NLD has calculated that there are still about 200 remaining in prisons whom we would deem to be prisoners of conscience. As to peace with the ethnic minorities, ethnic nationalities, that has not yet been achieved. And one of the necessities for the achievement of national reconciliation, which for me is much broader than just peace with the ethnic nationality. It also means peace between the civilian population and the military, building of confidence and trust and goodwill between all the different forces, political forces within our country. And that we have not yet achieved. And as to the solutions you talked about, Argentina or Mandela, that is to say Argentina or South Africa, I think we must look for a Burmese situation, a Burmese solution. And of course, you know, the Burmese who do not suffer from false modesty would believe that our solution will probably be better than the other two.
はい、ありがとうございました。それではあちらの方、はい、男性の方お願いいたします。
日本経済新聞の鈴木と申します。経済に関してお伺いします。ビルマの経済を、持続可能な成長に導くというふうにおっしゃいました。それで質問がありますが、今のビルマの経済というのは天然ガスなどの資源に依存されていると思うんですが、今後持続可能な成長を維持するためにはどのような産業、あるいはどのようなインフラ等が必要になるか教えてください。
We always have to remember that Burma is a predominantly agriculture society. More than 60% of our people live in the rural areas and their living is dependent on agriculture work. Because of that, we need to develop our agriculture sector in the right way if development is to be sustainable. I am a little concerned that the view most people take of agriculture is somewhat old-fashioned. And I'm always trying to persuade people to take a new look at agriculture, to think of agriculture in terms of the need for food security in our century, rather than in terms of the 20th century trend towards big conglomerates and monoculture. I am not particularly keen on the idea of monoculture taking over our agricultural sector. There is much that needs to be done, but first and foremost, what we need to make our economy look up is job creation. There is very high unemployment in our country, particularly among the young. And I've said again and again, this is a very dangerous situation. Unemployed youth is a danger for the future of our country. I keep repeating that it's not joblessness that worries me. It's the possibility of hopelessness among our youth. Once our youth have lost hope in the future and lost confidence in the ability of the society to allow them to live as dignified human beings, it will be very problematic for us to build a strong and sustainable society. So I would like economic aid to my country to keep in mind the need for job creation, particularly for the young and particularly in the rural areas as well as in the cities.
ありがとうございます。それではそちらの方お願いいたします。
個人会員の田村玲子と申します。総理の奥様の安倍昭恵さんがミャンマーに学校を作る運動をしていて、それで分かったことはビルマでは寺子屋があってお坊さんが子どもたちに教えて、で貧しいのに下から数えた方がいいぐらいの最貧国なのに識字率が90何%で寺子屋の役割っていうことをすごくすごいと気がついて、それで立教の大学院行ってそのミャンマーにおける寺子屋の役割というようなことで修士をお取りになったんですが、教育についてこれから国民をどんどん知的レベルを高くしていかなくちゃいけないと思うんですが、教育についてのお考えを伺いたい。
First of all, I think I must say that literacy in our country is not over 90%. Literacy has been defined in a very narrow narrow fashion. And according to that definition, it's over 90%. But if we think of literacy in terms of the ability of the people to read, to understand what they're reading, such as simple instructions on a bottle of medicine, then literacy in Burma certainly is not as high as 90%. With regard to the monastic schools, yes, they've always played a very important role in our country. And our legislature is trying to make it possible for the monastic schools to play a bigger role in the education of our young children by trying to provide salaries for teachers who teach at these monastic schools. The teachers in the monastic schools are paid by the community. They are not paid by the government. So we want to try to change that. The legislature is taking steps to change that. So our monastic schools can play a greater part in the education of our children. I would also like to mention that my party has set up a network of free schools, because all the education by the government is supposed to be free. That is to say, although the children do not formally have to give school fees, they are asked to make so many different kinds of contributions to the school that many poor people cannot afford to keep on sending their children to school. So there are a number of issues of serious concern with regard to our education system, and we're working very hard to change the situation. The legislature is working on a national education plan, which is very necessary. And once that has been drafted, we can discuss the needs of our society with regard to education in a more detailed manner.
ありがとうございました。それではそちらの方、はい。Please ask the gentleman behind the Mrs. Abe to ask this question. The one who is sitting behind Mrs. Abe, I want him to be able to ask question.
Yes, go. My name is Joël Lejean. I'm from RTL France, where you have many admirers, and it's a pleasure to see you so well. I've been working 20 years on Burma, as many of my colleagues, and when I came to Burma 20 years ago in the border, I've seen so many problems of sovereignty, and sovereignty for your country has been a crucial issue in the history. How do you perceive, and what would you like to perceive in the future for the sovereignty of your country with such powerful neighbors as you have, such as China and other forces in Southeast Asia? Thank you.
It has never particularly worried me that we have very large and powerful neighbors. Of course, it is not something that we can ignore. Very difficult to ignore the presence of either India or China. But you must remember that when Burma became independent in 1948, we were already next to India and China. Our geographical situation has not changed. But in those days, as a very young democracy, suffering from many problems because there were many insurgencies all over the country, and we were also suffering from the effects of the after effects of the Second World War, we still managed to maintain very good relations with different countries all over the world. Throughout the Cold War, we managed to keep neutral. We had perfectly good, before our military regime took over, we had perfectly good relations with the Western countries, with China, and with India. In fact, Burma was one of the very first countries in the world to recognize the communist government of China. Although we were a practicing, if not a perfect, democracy, and although we had very close relations with the West and with India to our West. So it does not worry me, because we do not live in an age where a big country can simply walk into a small country. I think we have got beyond that age of basic political savagery. And I'm very confident that we will be able to establish good relations with both our large neighbors and with countries further away from us, such as France.
Yes.
I don't mind, but he's been asking for a long time.
My name is Anthony Slatkovsky. I'm from Reuters in Tokyo. I wanted to ask you a question about the Muslim community in Myanmar. You have, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. So Anthony Slotkovsky from Reuters. As you mentioned at the beginning of the press conference, some international observers have perhaps criticized you for not being outspoken enough about the violence that has been perpetrated against Muslims in the Rakhine State and now in the central heartlands of Myanmar. Muslims are major supporters of the NLD, and I wonder what sort of message do you have to Muslim citizens in Myanmar, particularly at the time of this religious conflict where many of them perhaps fear for their lives? And if I may slide a second question, do you consider Rohingya people citizens of Myanmar? Thank you.
With regard to violence, I object to violence committed by anybody against anybody. It does not matter whether the violence is committed by Buddhists or by Muslims or by Christians. I object to it entirely. I've always been against violence, especially in politics. And I'm sorry that our people are not able to settle their differences across the table by talking to one another rather than by resorting to violence. I've said this very clearly, that any violation of human rights and any acts of violence are inimical to a united and peaceful society, and I stand by that. With regard to whether or not the Rohingya are citizens of the country, that depends very much on whether or not they meet the requirements of the citizenship laws as they now exist. There are those who say that the Burmese citizenship laws, which are based on the 1982 law, are not fair. Now that is a different question. At the present, what we have to find out is whether all those who are entitled to citizenship under the present law have been given citizenship. And once they've been given citizenship, have they been given all the rights of citizens? That has to be established first. And then we must go on to assess this citizenship law to find out whether it is in line with international standards. I think every country is entitled to say that they will work in accordance with existing laws, but at the same time, every country has a responsibility to consider the possibility that the laws are not in keeping with international standards. And this, the Burmese government should have the courage to do, to face the issue of citizenship fairly. With regard to the Muslims of Burma, I met some of the leaders of some Muslim leaders of Burma recently, just before I came to Japan, and we talked about all these communal problems. And it was very sad, but because none of them had ever known any other country except this one, I mean, that is to say, except Burma. And they did not feel that they belonged anywhere else, and it was sad for them that they were made to feel they did not belong in our country either. And this is a very sad state of affairs. We must learn to accommodate those with different views from ours. But as I said earlier, if we want our people to sort out the differences, we must give them security. We must make them feel secure enough to talk to one another. If you don't feel secure enough to go out of your house, if you're afraid that every time you go out of the house you might be attacked by somebody from a different community, how can you expect them to sit down and sort out their differences? Which is why I put so much emphasis to rule of law, and which is why people find my attitude so boring, because the rule of law is not exciting, but it is very necessary.
はい、ありがとうございました。そろそろ時間になってきましたので、次の質問で最後にしたいと思います。それでは、
Are you not going to ask the gentleman? I thought you said you were.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Just,
yes. Because he was one of the first to put up his hand.
いいですか。広渕正彦です。フリーランスです。Excuse me, I have some pain in my back, so let me ask you a question. While sitting. Thank you. 最も大事と思われる質問、国名についてです。お国の名前。ずっと聞いていると、ずっとバーマーとビルマと言っておられるんですね。で、数年前にミャンマーという国 国名に変えたときにですね、日本のジャーナリズムの一部には、そのミャンマーというのは軍事政権がつけた名前だから、これを使わちゃいけないと。欧米のジャーナリズムにもそういう論がありました。ところがですね、元、それこそ駐ビルマ大使の一人がお書きになった本によると、ビルマという名前はそんなに歴史のあるものではないと。これはむしろイギリス植民地主義者たちがつけた名前だと。それでですね、私も半年ほど前に在日英国大使と会見したときに、ミャンマーという質問をしたらですね、彼の答えはすべてビルマって返ってきたんですよ。そこでアウンサンスーチーさんの頭の心の中にですね、いまだにそのミャンマーという呼称は好ましくないんだと、ビルマが正しいんだと思っておられるのかどうかね、そこを聞きたい。
The reason why I've always referred to Burma as Burma is because previously, when the military regime changed the name of the English name, the international name of the country. Of course, Myanmar is our name for Burma, as Nihon is your name for Japan. And so in Burma, we've always referred to Burma as Myanmar. That's in our language. But since independence and before that, we have referred to Burma as Burma outside our country. The name was changed by the military regime. Suddenly, one day, it was announced that our country would be known as Myanmar from now on. And there was no reference to the will of the people. And that is my main objection to the name, that it was chosen by the military regime without any reference to the will of the people, without asking whether the people found it acceptable or not. That is one reason. And the second reason is that they explained the name in terms which were not factually correct. They said that Myanmar referred to all the ethnic nationalities of Burma, whereas Burma, which is based on the word Burma, referred only to the Burmese ethnic group. This is not true. Myanmar is a literary form of Burma. So Myanmar also refers only to the Burmese ethnic group. So the reason given for the change was not correct either. Now, with regard to what the Japanese call Burma, I would say that you pronounce Biruma so much more nicely than you pronounce Myanmar. It sounds so much nicer, Biruma, than Myanmar, pronounced by the Japanese and by other foreigners who find it very difficult. When you hear a Westerner saying Myanmar, it doesn't sound quite right. But they can manage Birmani very well, and they can manage Burma very well. It sounds much better. And then, as for the explanation that Burma was a name given to the country by the colonialists, that is to say, by foreigners. Well, Japan is not exactly the name given to this country by the Japanese, but we like it very well, and the Japanese people, I think, have enough confidence in their achievements to accept that name. I think the reason why the military government rejected the name Burma was because they did not have the confidence to accept it. Think of the biggest, the most powerful countries in Asia, China, India, Japan. These are all names given by the Westerners. These are not native names, but because they have confidence in their own country, in the achievements of their civilization and of their modern history, they can live with those names. Why can't we live with the name Burma? But on the other hand, I don't insist on it. What I object to is that people should try to force me to say Myanmar if I wish to say Burma. There is no law in my country that says that I cannot refer to my country as Burma if I please, and I shall go on referring to my country as Burma as long as I please. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。それでは時間が過ぎてしまいましたので大変恐縮なんですけれども、ここで質問を受けさせていただくのは最後にしたいと思います。 そしてこちらゲストブックなんですが、先ほど控室の方でアウンサンスーチーさんに書いていただきました。ここには日本との協力の将来というのを期待していますというふうに添えていただきました。また最後には今日ちょうど4月17日はお国の旧正月ということだそうで、それも書いていただきました。どうもありがとうございました。それではクラブからの記念品としてクラブ特製の風呂敷なんですが、これを差し上げたいと思います。それでは出席の皆さん、ご協力どうもありがとうございました。アウンサンスーチーさんが退席されるまでどうぞおかけになってお待ちください。今日は本当にどうもありがとうございました。